Thanks for coming. My topic is standard operating procedures, a basic introduction. Now, you may be familiar with standard operating procedures, or you may have heard that term from safety training or other interactions you might have had here on campus. Standard operating procedures are most common in industry and in manufacturing, but they have applications in academia as well. But if you haven't heard of a standard operating procedure before, what is it? Well, according to D.H. Shaw, the author of the book you see to your right, SOP Guidelines, Electronic Data Management, SOPs describe a controlled process to get a specific outcome. They allow a consistent implementation of a process or procedure, even if there is a change in personnel. Christina Rodriguez, one of our lab alumni, who some of you may recall having met, says that standard operating procedures are the median between what we do in our company and the FDA regulations we must comply with. Following the SOPs in industry ensures that we stay in compliance with the applicable regulations. And Chrissy is talking about a biotech company that she works at, and she works in manufacturing. So that's what standard operating procedures mean to her. So let's take a closer look. Standard operating procedures are very similar to the protocols that we use here in our lab, but the format of standard operating procedures and what they include can vary between companies and organizations. In some companies, standard operating procedures describe equipment use, and what you do with the equipment they would refer to as a protocol. But a key point is that in a biotech context, in a pharmaceutical context, the Food and Drug Administration reviews standard operating procedures during their inspections. And you want to make sure your standard operating procedure is in compliance with any regulations that they may have. And they may walk through your facility and they may point to somebody and they may say, okay, that person over there is engaged in a task. What standard operating procedure is that person using? And then you would be asked to provide it. So what components go into a standard operating procedure? Well, like the protocols that we have, there's a list of the materials and components you'll need to complete the procedure. There's a list of instructions for handling reagents and mixing compounds. There's a list of the equipment required, the capabilities of that equipment, and if the situation calls for it, a model number as well. And there is a stepwise description of the process, including the quantities of reagents that you might use. There are process control parameters within acceptable limits. What does this mean? Well, if you're engaged in a process that requires a set temperature, for example, the standard operating procedure will specify what the temperature is to be, what the temperature range and limits are to be. The standard operating procedure will also typically have test methods to ensure that your process worked the way you wanted it to. And it might talk about data handling. It might, if you're manufacturing something, it might call for reporting and documentation requirements. These are sometimes called batch records for the batch of whatever it is you're manufacturing. If applicable, it'll also include training requirements for a given piece of equipment, and it'll define relative terms or relevant terms if needed. So what format should a standard operating procedure have? Well, there is no approved formats or guidelines from the Food and Drug Administration for standard operating procedures, so there is some leeway allowed here. There are some general industry guidelines as to how a standard operating procedure should be formatted, though. Typically, your standard operating procedure should have a company name, a division, or a branch of whatever organization it is you're working for. The page numbers should have a page number of numbers, so page 1 of 2, or 5 of 6, or whatever the case may be. It should have a clear title that identifies the activity or procedure that it is outlining. It should have a date of issue, and it should have a unique identification number. It should have a table of contents depending on the length of the SOP. If it's a very short SOP, maybe this is not necessary, but if it's a longer one, you will want to include a table of contents. And furthermore, every organization should have a template for creating SOPs and an SOP for creating SOPs. I know it's sort of layers within layers, but that is all to help ensure consistency. What about detail, though? How much detail should a standard operating procedure have? Well, again, there are no hard and fast rules, but you want to consider who is performing the task, what training is required, what training will that person have. You'll want to have enough detail to be able to perform the task just from the SOP, given the training and background that the person is who's performing it should have. And so, for example, if your SOP says that somebody must be trained on the MIC qPCR thermocycler that we have, then the standard operating procedure for using that machine or for doing a particular kind of assay on it can be written with that training in mind, but that training must be specified. And so you want to make it so that a person with that training could perform the task just from the standard operating procedure itself. And you should also ask yourself, what would happen if there is a deviation on a particular step of the standard operating procedure? And because if you deviate from the SOP, you have to document that change. And this is where the potential for excess detail could become problematic. If you have too much detail, then you'll generate too many deviation reports, because generally speaking, you will want to document any deviation from a standard operating procedure that you have. So it's very much a balance involved with creating standard operating procedures. Now, what kind of writing style should we use in an SOP? Well, again, the skill and experience of the users is important. You'll also want to consider language comprehension levels, specifically if you're working with staff who are working with an SOP that's in your non-native language or their non-native language. You'll want to be considerate of that fact and ensure that it's written in such a way so that they can understand it as well. Furthermore, you'll want to ask yourself if every step of the standard operating procedure will be referenced as the process is performed, or will it be referenced occasionally and performed from memory. This is something that if it's a process that is done very frequently, then you will have people who are doing it from memory if that's reasonably possible. If it's a simple procedure, and you'll want to write accordingly. You'll also want to have the fewest words necessary. This is to help keep it simple and concise. You'll want to write in the present tense as well. So you'll say, turn on thermocycler, and then remove previous tubes, and talk in that terms. And flowcharts and diagrams are useful as well for helping to understand exactly what is meant to occur. And so if you have a particular machine that has a particular interface, you might want to include a diagram of that machine, and you'll want to maybe document what the interface is and how they might interact with that interface to perform an SOP. So this has all been very general and non-specific, but let's take a look at an SOP that I have written according to these guidelines. Specifically, I've taken one of our protocols and I have modified it to meet these guidelines. And let's look at where our lab is at in terms of our protocols and how well and how they meet these criteria, and but what else and how we could modify them to to be further in compliance with a standard operating procedure as defined. So firstly, one of the requirements for an SOP is that it be written by somebody who is familiar with the procedure itself. And here, because I have extensive experience with qPCR, I've taken our qPCR protocol. And on the left, you'll see our protocol as it was before. Now, when I looked at our protocols, we're actually doing very well in meeting SOP guidelines and suggestions in a number of ways. Our protocols have a unique number identifier with a protocol for updating it. And so the file name for this actually has a unique number identifier. You won't see it here because I'm showing you the protocol itself rather than the file, and that's very good. It has the original author, which is Cristina Rodriguez, the writing and revision date, and it's based on a protocol from BioLine, who makes our qPCR reagents. So we're doing very well in these areas. But to further make it meet the SOP suggestions and guidelines, I have updated the title to be more specific and descriptive of exactly what the process is. I have put our institution, department, and lab here as well. And I have noted that I have updated it on this day. So that's how the title page has been revised and updated. I have also, this is the first page, I've added a little bit more description here, and I have added handling requirements for these materials. Specifically, I have specified that I really should have said stored at -20 degrees Celsius for all of these here instead of frozen. That would have been a little bit better, but I've recommended they be stored on ice at 4 degrees while you're working with these, but I've specified they also must be melted and in liquid form when you're working with them. I've noted materials, I've noted PPE as well, and so I think that would be helpful as well. I've just taken this section out, but I also included page numbers. So this here would say page 1 of 5, I think. So let's take a look at another page of this protocol that I have modified to meet these SOP guidelines and see a few other things here. A good SOP should have mixing of the reagents specified. And so here I've included the chart for mixing these reagents that you would use to perform qPCR according to how many samples you have. That was not there before, and I think that is very helpful. And that's the main thing I've updated here. And afterwards, I will make both the original protocol and the SOP as updated here available to all of you, so you can look at it. And I would invite you to look at the document with the revisions being shown, and so you can see exactly how it was revised. I won't discuss the entire updated qPCR SOP because it would be very time consuming to go through each detail, but I will make that available to all of you now. And so finally, I would like to talk about how standard operating procedures can be useful in our lab. How do we use them in our lab? How can we benefit from them? Well, SOPs are mandated for certain things like waste disposal and cleanup by the university, so we'll be using them for that. Standard operating procedures, in terms of what we do specifically, are most useful for tasks that are repeated often and where there is a need for consistency. So making collagen, for example, or extracting collagen from rat tails, which is what we do, would benefit from an SOP meeting SOP guidelines. Waste disposal, we're required to do that by the university. qPCR is also something where you would want to have an SOP for doing that on our thermocycler, because you do want to have a lot of consistency there. And if we're developing repeatable processes that have industrial applications in our lab, then having a standard operating procedure for that would also be very useful, because we would, if we want to transfer our process to industry, they would want to have something like that. I know that our lab does not necessarily do this as much as other labs do. The Chartrand lab, if you worked with them, their work is all about developing industrial processes for manufacturing. So if you work with that lab or in a lab that's doing that kind of work, you would want to keep that in mind. But also doing SOPs in our lab, formatting our protocols in the SOP format and according to SOP guidelines would be very useful. They're very useful for practice. And so talking about writing protocols in our lab and how it prepared her, Christina Rodriguez says that I would say the protocol I wrote in lab is a very basic version of the protocols I write now, but definitely helped give me a leg up when writing the ones I do now. And so if you go into industry and you're writing protocols here in our lab according to SOP guidelines, and you're familiar with working with them, then when you're interviewed or on your resume, you could say that you have familiarity with standard operating procedures, and that will be noticed and will be advantageous when you're applying for a job. And so in conclusion, I would like to acknowledge both D.H. Shaw, who wrote the SOP guidelines book. I have a copy of it if you're interested in reviewing it for your own purposes. And I'd like to thank our our lab alumni, Christina Rodriguez, for helping to offer some advice in this presentation. And I'd like to open it up for questions now, if anyone has questions.
Thank you very much, Shane. That's very informative. I'm actually very glad you reached out to Christina. How's Christina doing?
Well, she's doing very well. Christina is a contract engineer at Amgen. And when I told her that I was doing this, I asked her if she would offer her insight, and she was very happy to do that. She took a look at the SOP that she wrote about qPCR. She took a look at the revised ones, or the revised one that I have, and she offered me some points and offered me some insight and the benefit of her experience. And that was very helpful. And Christina's very successful, and we're all very happy for her success, and she absolutely deserves it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.